Colorado Territory 1876 winter hadn't quite loosened its grip. The prairie wore a thin frost, and the breeze that moved through the cottonwood sounded like a warning no one could yet understand. Thomas Morgan stood on his porch with a dented tin cup scanning the corral and the long, low hills beyond. He was 35, broad-shouldered from work, hollow-eyed from the kind of quiet that follows a funeral and refuses to leave. Fences leaned, boards squeaked, and the house behind him felt bigger than any one man ought to live in alone. Movement flickered at the far end of the drive. A woman was walking toward him on foot, no horse, no wagon boots, scuffed nearly through a shawl pinned tight against a stubborn wind. In her arms, a bundled infant rode the rhythm of her steps, cheek tucked into her collarbone. She was small, yes, but her pace never wavered. Dust clung to her skirt, and the tiredness in her face had the clean look of someone who'd kept moving rather than lie down and lose. When she reached the gate, she rested one hand on it, steadying herself, and lifted her eyes. "Morning," she said. "Name's Clara. This is Jonah." She glanced down at the sleeping child. "He's 8 months. We've been walking a while." Thomas didn't move closer. "You headed somewhere in particular?" "Here for now, if you'll let us catch our breath." She surprised him by adding quickly, "I'm not asking charity. I can cook so scrub men. I'll sleep in the barn if that's the price. Just a little bread for him and a day where the ground isn't moving under our feet." From inside the house came the slap of a screen door. Papa A, curl-headed blur, burst off the steps. Ellie Morgan, 4 years old, all bare feet and unstoppable questions, darted across the yard before Thomas could call her back. "Ellie, stay," he started, but the girl was already there, stopping just shy of the stranger, tipping her face up the way children do when they're deciding whether to trust a sunrise. Clara dropped her gaze to Ellie and gave the smallest smile, the kind that keeps its distance until invited. Jonah stirred, gave a soft, hungry sound, and settled again. Ellie edged closer, pinched the hem of Clara's skirt between 2 fingers, and leaned in as if the entire decision of the morning could be made with a breath. "She smells like Mama Ellie," announced, satisfied, and looked over her shoulder at Thomas as if she'd solved something adults never could. The words landed hard. 2 years of silence cracked in one heartbeat. Mama wasn't a word used out loud on this porch. It lived beneath the floorboards with the memory of a doctor who'd ridden too slow and a grave behind the cottonwood that Thomas couldn't look at without feeling the world tilt. Clara's eyes dropped. "I'm sorry," she said, almost a whisper. "I shouldn't have come to your door like this." Thomas stepped down off the porch, boots crunching lightly on the frost. He took in the shawl, the blistered boots, the careful way she held the child, so his face was always turned from the wind. He hadn't asked anyone for help in a long time, and he'd forgotten what it looked like to be the one asked. "You got people who'll be hunting you?" he asked. "No, sir," Clara said, steadying her voice. "There's no one looking for us. Your husband." The question scraped as it came out. "Gone before the snow set. We kept walking anyway." She adjusted Jonah with practiced hands. "We just need a place to stop. I'll earn it. I swear it." Ellie had not moved. She stood so close to Clara now that her curls brushed Jonah's blanket. "Can he talk?" Ellie asked. "Not yet," Clara said, and the almost smile returned for one heartbeat, real this time. The yard held its breath. Thomas rubbed the back of his neck, the old habit of a man who knows every answer costs something. He could say no, the world often did. He could say yes and invite the whole town's opinion to dinner. He could tell himself that letting a stranger past his gate would be disloyal to the woman who would never again step through it. Clara shifted her weight. "Thank you for your time," she said, already turning. Ellie moved faster than thought. She wrapped both arms around Clara's legs, small and fierce. "Don't go." The plea wasn't dramatic. It was simple, like a truth too young to hide. Clara froze, unsure whether to pry the child free or apologize. Her eyes met Thomas's over Ellie's head. In them, he didn't see weakness. He saw stubborn, ordinary courage, the kind that gets laundry dry on a bad day and babies through bad nights. Thomas crossed the yard and swung the gate open. The hinges protested. He ignored them. "The bunkhouse," he said, nodding toward the small building behind the kitchen garden. 4 walls, a stove cot's narrow, but it's warm. Clara blinked like she'd prepared for every answer, but this one. "You mean it? I don't say things I don't." He glanced at Ellie. "And she doesn't either." Ellie beamed, certain now she'd done important work. She slipped her hand into Clara's free one as naturally as you'd take a breath. The three of them, man, woman, child, with a baby dozing between them, walked through the gate together. Thomas felt the old house behind him shift in his mind from a structure built to withstand wind to a place that for the first time in a long time might hold people again. As they crossed the yard, the morning light cleared the last of the frost from the railing. Clara didn't step like a beggar. She moved like someone who'd carried a load a long way and finally found a spot level enough to set it down for a minute. "Thank you," she said, not oversweet, not pleading, just the kind that lands with weight. Ellie leaned close, conspiratorial. "You really do smell like Mama," she whispered. Clara didn't correct her. And Thomas, who had taught himself to say no to anything that might hurt again, realized he didn't have it in him to ask this woman to leave. Not after that. Not today. Maybe not ever. By the second morning, Clara had taken the small, drafty bunkhouse and made it feel like something more than four walls and a cot. She had folded blankets with care, scrubbed the soot off the stove until it shone, and arranged Jonah's cradle where the light from the window could touch it gently each morning. For a woman who had walked miles with nothing but grit and a child in her arms, she carried a gift for turning a place of survival into the beginnings of a home. Ellie shadowed her every step, trailing behind, with her rag doll eager to learn. When Clara stirred a pot, Ellie stirred beside her. When Clara pinned shirts on the line, Ellie offered the clothespins. It didn't take long for the child to look at Clara with the trust only a little girl can give. Clara never waited to be asked. She moved with the instinct of someone who had learned to spot what needed fixing and quietly see it done. The hinge on the back door that had squealed for months, she oiled and tightened. Ellie's dress too tight under the arms, she unstitched and resewed, using thread pulled from an old curtain hem. The hearthstone in the kitchen blackened with years of neglect, she scrubbed until the gray of the stone returned. She cooked without fuss, corn chowder, biscuits, bread, with a crust so firm that Ellie giggled when it cracked under her teeth. For Thomas, who had lived with silence and bare necessity for so long, her quiet competence filled the air with something unfamiliar life. And though Thomas never said much, his actions betrayed the stirrings of something deeper. One morning he walked 10 miles into town claiming he needed nails for the barn. But when he returned, Ellie came running out of the bunkhouse wearing a soft blue dress trimmed with lace at the cuffs. Sleeves a little long but perfect all the same. She twirled on the porch laughing. "Papa, look, Mama Willa fixed it for me." Clara stood behind, half in shadow, cheeks flushed. Thomas tipped his hat lower, unable to stop the storm in his chest. The dress had not come from Clara's needle alone. He had bought it quietly at the mercantile, pretending to browse tools until he could slip the bundle into his coat. And now, seeing his daughter beam in it, he felt a knot inside him loosen, though he couldn't name why. Then Ellie said the words that cut through him like no storm could Mama Willa. She said it with the careless certainty of a child who doesn't know grief is supposed to last forever. For her, the title wasn't a replacement. It was a truth she felt in the way Clara tucked her in at night or hummed Jonah to sleep while stirring supper. For Thomas, the sound of it tore open places he thought he had sealed with work and silence. Yet even as it hurt, it also healed. He found himself standing a little straighter, lingering longer at the doorway, watching the three of them together. He didn't say anything, but he didn't correct his daughter either. Not when her smile said everything he couldn't. Clara never spared herself the hard work that came with life on a ranch. She was up before dawn, sleeves rolled high, scrubbing kettles that had long since lost their shine, and sweeping the hearthstone until it gleamed. She repaired what was broken with quiet persistence, mending seams, patching blankets, or carrying buckets of water without complaint. Thomas noticed her hands raw from soap and heat, but he also noticed the way she carried herself steady, determined, unwilling to let hardship define her. She didn't ask for thanks, and she didn't wait for praise. She simply did what needed doing, as if caring for others was the only language she had ever known. The test of her presence came one stormy night. Ellie woke with a fever, cheeks flushed and breath shallow, whimpering for her mother. Before Thomas could move, Clara was already there, kneeling at the girl's bedside. She dampened a cloth and pressed it gently to Ellie's forehead, humming low songs that were more comfort than medicine. She held Jonah on one side, Ellie on the other, her arms forming a shield as thunder rattled the windows. The little girl's cries eased her breathing, steadied, until at last she slept curled against Clara's chest. Jonah too quieted in the safety of her embrace. When Thomas came down, shotgun in hand from the noise, what he found stopped him cold. Clara sat on the kitchen floor with both children nestled against her, their small bodies rising and falling with her steady breath. The lantern light caught the loosened strands of her hair, framing her face with softness he hadn't expected. For a long moment, Thomas just stood there watching the picture. They made three souls bound together, as if it had always been so. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Instead, he pulled a blanket from the sofa and draped it gently over all three. His hand hovered a second above Clara's shoulder, aching to rest there before pulling back. That small, wordless gesture was his first acknowledgement of the truth. He could no longer deny this woman, once a stranger, was becoming the center of his family. The air inside the ranch house was warm, with the scent of soap and wet metal. Clara stood at the wash basin, sleeves pushed up past her elbows, scrubbing soot from a blackened kettle that had clearly outlived its usefulness. Her movements were steady, practiced, but her silence hung heavier than the kettle itself. Thomas lingered in the doorway, arms folded across his chest, the firelight catching the weariness etched deep into his face. He cleared his throat, voice low, almost hesitant. "You don't talk much about where you came from." Clara's hands stilled for a moment, but she didn't turn around. "Not much worth telling," she replied quietly. She might have left it at that, but when she glanced sideways, she saw him, simply waiting silent, patient, unwilling to let her hide behind half-truths. So the words began to spill out, jagged at first, then smoother, as though they had been waiting for years. She spoke of a father broken by whiskey, a man whose sorrow turned mean whenever the bottle was near. She told of her mother's death when she was only 10 years old, and how she had kept the house together after that, cooking, cleaning, tending the fire with hands still small for the work. Her voice wavered but did not break. Marriage, she thought, had been her chance at escape. But that dream dissolved the moment her husband learned she carried a child. He vanished without a note, leaving her to face winter alone. Jonah was born in spring, and since then, every mile she had walked was carved by survival. When she finally looked up, Thomas had stepped closer, his eyes shadowed with something raw. He spoke then, not as a rancher, not as a guarded man, but as someone laying bare an old wound. Jane, his wife, had died the day after Ellie was born. He had ridden 12 desperate miles through the night to fetch a doctor, but help arrived too late. He described sitting in the quiet house, an infant wailing in his arms, staring at the door as though sheer will might make it open again. It never did. Silence fell, not awkward, but sacred, carrying both their sorrows. Clara felt her chest ache with recognition. Thomas, too, seemed to find a strange comfort in her presence, as if grief shared was grief lessened. They had both been hollowed by loss, scarred by betrayal and death. Yet in that dim kitchen they discovered something rare: understanding. Neither had planned it, but both knew it. This was the beginning of trust and perhaps the seed of something stronger. By the second Sunday of the month, the weight of whispers in town had grown too loud to ignore. At the mercantile, women lingered near the shelves longer than necessary, their eyes following Clara, as though she carried something contagious. At the pump, a man muttered just loud enough for Thomas to hear, spitting near his boots with a sneer about a stranger warming herself under his roof. Each comment was small, but together they formed a tide of suspicion that pressed harder every day. Still, Thomas walked into church with Clara at his side, Ellie skipping happily and Jonah asleep against her shoulder. They sat in the back as they always did, quiet and unobtrusive. For most of the service, nothing stirred beyond the familiar rhythm of hymns and prayers. But as the congregation began to rise, the air shifted. Clara Finch, a widow of means, her dresses always starched crisp, and her tongue sharper than any blade, stepped directly into their path. My, she drawled, her gaze sweeping over Clara with deliberate cruelty. The good Lord surely blesses some more than others. A roof, a job, a man's house. She paused, her eyes flicking to Thomas with an arch of her brow. Tell me, is this one of those arrangements where help means something else? The words struck like stones thrown in silence. Conversations died. Feet froze mid-step. Clara stiffened, her face pale, but she held her ground, though her hand trembled on Jonah's blanket. Ellie clung to her skirt, wide-eyed. Thomas did not raise his voice, nor did he meet Clara Finch's gaze at first. Instead, he adjusted the blanket more securely around Jonah, then straightened to his full height. His tone was calm, clear, and deliberate. "She works harder than anyone in this town," he said, "and Ellie has not smiled like this in years until Clara walked through that gate." The church was silent. Clara Finch blinked, her words suddenly brittle. Thomas nodded once, final and firm. "You can pray about that if you like." He reached for Clara's hand, not to claim, but to honor, showing the town where he stood. Together they walked out into the sun, leaving the whispers behind them. The drizzle had just begun to fall when Thomas noticed a rider cutting across the ridge, tall in the saddle of a lean gray horse. The man carried himself with the smug ease of someone who believed the land belonged to him. He dismounted at the gate without waiting for invitation, wiping rain from his brow with a leather glove. "Looking for Clara Hart," he said smoothly. "Tell her Emery Tate is here." The name chilled the air. Clara, watching through the window with Jonah asleep on the rug, froze. Her past buried under miles of trail dust had arrived on horseback. When she stepped outside, shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, her face went pale. "I thought you were dead," she whispered. "Well, I ain't," Emery replied with a half smile. "Been in Wyoming mining. Heard I got a boy." He tipped his chin toward the house. "He's mine by blood. I've come to take him home." Rage burned in Thomas's chest, but he kept his stance steady, stepping between Emery and the door. "You left before he was born. That doesn't make him yours." Emery's smile hardened. "He carries my name, whether you like it or not. Kansas family's waiting. You don't stand in the way of blood." With that, he swung into his saddle and rode off, leaving the threat hanging heavy as storm clouds. That night, Clara quietly packed her meager belongings, a shawl, 2 dresses, Jonah's sling. She could not risk violence coming down on Thomas or Ellie. Her fingers trembled on the latch when she heard boots behind her. Thomas's voice stopped her. "You're not going." His tone was quiet, unyielding. "I can't fight him," she said, tears threatening. "You already have," Thomas answered. "He doesn't know Jonah's laugh or his cry. You do. You are his home." The conviction in his voice cracked something inside her, and for the first time Clara believed it. But belief was not enough. Trouble came before dawn. Boots thundered across the gravel. Shouts pierced the night. Clara's screams split the air. Jonah's cradle was empty. Outside, 2 riders galloped into the storm, one clutching a bundle wrapped in blue. Thomas mounted bareback, blood pounding in his ears. He chased them into the woods mud, spraying under his horse's hooves. He caught up by the creek, but a rifle butt slammed across his jaw, sending him crashing to the ground. "Stay down," the man snarled, cradling Jonah in his arm. Clara appeared drenched and shaking, but fierce, Thomas's rifle clutched in her hands. "Put him down," she ordered. The kidnapper hesitated. Her hands steadied. She fired into the air, the blast echoing like thunder. Lanterns flared across the valley. Doors opened, dogs barked, neighbors poured out. "Drop the boy," someone shouted. Under the weight of eyes and voices, the man faltered. Slowly he lowered Jonah, crying but safe, into Clara's arms. She clutched him tight, whispering his name like a prayer. Thomas staggered to his feet, blood streaking his temple, but alive. Then Emery himself shoved forward, shouting over the din. "She kidnapped him. He's mine by law and blood." But no one moved to help. The townsfolk had seen enough. "She saved that child," someone muttered. "Protected him like any mother would," another said. A farmer stepped forward, eyes cold. "You best ride out Tate before someone aims lower." Emery scanned the faces, stern, unyielding, and knew the verdict had been passed. With a curse, he mounted and vanished into the night. In the silence that followed, Clara held Jonah close while Thomas stood beside her, battered but unbowed. For the first time, it was not just her fight. The town itself had spoken. The night after the confrontation with Emery Tate still clung to the air, heavy as the storm that had drenched the valley. Thomas's jaw carried the mark of a rifle butt, swollen and darkened, a wound that throbbed with every movement. At dawn, Clara filled a basin with warm water, her hands steady, though her heart was still racing from the terror of nearly losing Jonah. "Hold still," she murmured as she pressed the damp cloth against the bruised skin. Thomas sat stiffly, silent but obedient. His jaw tightened under her touch, though he never flinched. Jonah slept soundly in his cradle, and Ellie sat cross-legged on the floor, her crayon scratching furiously across a scrap of paper. She didn't notice the tension between the adults, or perhaps she did and tried to mend it in her own way. "I'm drawing us," Ellie announced proudly, holding up the finished picture. Four stick figures stood beneath a bright yellow sun, one tall with a wide hat, one with long hair, and two small ones clasping hands between them. She grinned. You and Papa, me and Jonah. That's our family. The simple innocence in her voice stunned the room. Clara froze the cloth still in her hand, eyes brimming, though she tried to hide it. Thomas's shoulders tightened, and for a moment he couldn't find his voice. Then slowly he reached over and set a hand on Ellie's curls. It's beautiful, sweetheart, Clara whispered. Ellie beamed, certain she had captured truth on paper. That afternoon, with the storm clouds finally clearing, Thomas hitched up two horses and suggested a walk along the ridge. Clara carried Jonah in a sling across her chest, while Ellie bounced happily at her side, one small hand clinging to her father's calloused fingers. For a long stretch, no one spoke. The only sounds were hooves on damp earth and birds calling from the thickets. When they reached the crest, the valley unfurled below them, wildflowers still bowing from rain fence posts, glistening in sunlight. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Oh, it is beautiful here, she whispered. Her smile was different this time, not cautious, not polite, but unguarded and full. For the first time since she had arrived, Thomas saw her as more than a survivor. He saw a woman who could belong. The sight loosened something inside him, a knot tied since the day he buried his wife. He didn't smile back, but the change was there, written in the softening of his eyes. That evening, after Ellie had gone to bed and Jonah lay asleep in his cradle, Thomas stepped onto the porch. The stars glimmered above, scattered like silver dust across the ink-black sky. The swing at the end of the porch creaked in the breeze, broken for years since his late wife's illness. Tonight, though, he carried rope and a sanded board. His fingers worked with quiet determination, knotting each length until the seat hung true. Then, for reasons he barely admitted to himself, he added a second swing beside the first, close, but not too close. When Clara stepped outside with a towel draped over her arm, she stopped short. The lantern light fell on Thomas as he tightened the last knot. For once, he looked uncertain, almost boyish, as though he wasn't sure if the gesture was too much. Clara set down the towel, her gaze softening. She walked forward, ran her hand along the smooth wood, and then, without waiting for permission, sat down. Thomas hesitated, then lowered himself into the old swing beside her. The wood creaked, but it held. For a long while they said nothing, rocking gently side by side, shoulders close but not touching. Crickets sang in the grass. The cool night air smelled of rain and cottonwood. Thank you, Clara whispered at last. Thomas glanced sideways. For what? For giving me a place to breathe. Her voice was low, almost carried off by the wind. He didn't answer, but after a moment he reached down and gave the swing one gentle push. The two swings moved together in rhythm, their silence speaking louder than any words. It was not yet a promise, not yet a vow, but it was a beginning, fragile, tentative, and real. For the first time, the lonely rancher and the wandering mother sat side by side, not as strangers, bound by circumstance, but as two people daring to imagine what family could mean. The morning Elias Morgan arrived, the ranch seemed to hold its breath. His dark carriage rolled up the drive like a storm cloud, the horses slick with sweat despite the cool air. Thomas stood on the porch, Ellie clutching the back of his leg, wary of the tall figure who descended in pressed city black jaw, hard as stone, and eyes a cold shade of blue. I heard troubling things, Elias said by way of greeting, his voice sharp as a chisel. So I came. They sat stiffly in the parlor. Clara kept to the kitchen, Jonah nestled against her chest, while the men's voices carried low and heavy through the walls. Elias wasted no time. A woman with a bastard child under your roof. The town whispers, Rhett he always called his son by the old family name, and I raised you to rise above scandal, not wallow in it. Thomas's jaw tightened. She works hard. She's kind. Ellie adores her. She is not your wife, Elias snapped. His tone dropped to something colder, almost pitying. And she never will be. She does not belong here, son. Find someone worthy of your name. The words cut like barbed wire. Clara, listening from the kitchen doorway, felt her knees weaken. She turned away before anyone could see her tears. Upstairs, she folded her meager belongings, 2 dresses, a shawl, the cloth sling for Jonah. Her fingers brushed over Ellie's drawing pinned above the cot, 4 stick figures, beneath a bright sun, a vision of family that had felt for a moment possible. Her hands trembled, but she packed anyway. She waited until twilight. Elias had retired to the guest room, and Ellie slept curled in her blanket. Clara slipped out the back door shawl, pulled tight. Jonah bundled close. In the barn, the air smelled of hay and pine. She saddled the mule quietly, heartbreaking, with every buckle fastened. She would leave without goodbye. Better that way, she told herself. But footsteps crunched behind her. Thomas stood in the doorway, the fading light shadowing his face. His arms hung loose at his sides, but his eyes carried something she couldn't read. "I'm not here to stop you," he said softly. Clara looked down, her voice unsteady. "I heard what your father said. He's right." "Is he?" Thomas stepped closer. "I don't belong here. Not with your name, not with your family's pride." She pulled the strap tighter. "It's better if I go." He exhaled, his voice rough but steady. "If you're leaving because you want to, I won't hold you back. I'll even help you pack." Her breath caught. She dared not look at him, but he continued softer. "Now, if you're leaving because someone made you feel less than you are, because you think your past makes you unworthy, then don't." His eyes burned with quiet conviction. "This ranch is just walls and dust without you. But if you call it home, it becomes one." The barn fell silent except for the rustle of wind through the doors. Clara stared at him, her throat aching. "You don't have to choose between pride and peace," he said. "Not here. Not with me." Jonah stirred in her sling, letting out a small yawn. Clara's eyes welled, torn between the road and the man standing before her, between the weight of shame and the possibility of belonging. "Do you mean that?" she whispered. "I've never meant anything more." Her fingers lingered on the mule's strap, then slowly unbuckled it. The leather slipped free with a soft sigh. Clara turned, crossing the barn until she stood beside him. Thomas didn't smile, but his hand brushed the door open wider. She stepped through into the night, not as a runaway, but as someone choosing to stay. The peace they had fought for did not last long. One gray morning, a deputy rode up the lane with a folded letter sealed in wax. Clara opened it with trembling fingers, her knees nearly giving way as she read the words. Emery Tate had filed a custody petition. The document painted her as unfit a mother, with no income, a checkered past, and questionable morals for living under another man's roof. Worst of all, several townsfolk had signed statements against her. Each word felt like a blade cutting at the fragile stability she had built. Rhett read the letter silently, jaw clenched, eyes like iron. "He's not going to take Jonah." Clara whispered, voice breaking. "He can't. We'll fight this," Rhett answered, his voice steady, even as anger burned beneath it. That very night, he wrote to an old lawyer friend in Denver, enclosing Jonah's birth records, details of Emery's abandonment, and a plea for help. The lawyer promised to arrive before the hearing, but warned the case would be close. Then came the fire. It was past midnight when Ellie's scream split the dark. Smoke curled under the door flames, already licking the rafters of the grain store. "The barn," she cried, pointing toward the window. Clara's heart seized. Jonah's crib had been moved into the cool pantry near the barn for the night. Without thinking, she bolted into the storm, bare feet slicing on gravel, Ellie right behind her. The air was thick with heat and ash. Sparks rained down like angry stars. From inside the pantry came Jonah's panicked wail. Clara kicked the door until the wood splintered, rushing through smoke and flame. The heat seared her palms, but she wrapped Jonah against her chest, shielding his tiny face with her shawl. She stumbled back into the night lungs, burning Ellie, clutching a damp cloth over her mouth. Near the creek, Rhett fought one of the arsonists, an older boy likely hired by Emery. Fists struck mud, grunts drowned by the roar of fire. The glint of steel flashed. The knife cut across Rhett's ribs. He staggered, pain searing, but managed to drop the boy with a final blow. Blood stained his shirt, but his eyes stayed locked on Clara and the children, alive and safe. By dawn, the barn was nothing but smoldering ash. Rhett could barely stand, leaning heavily on the porch rail, sweat pouring down his face. When the lawyer arrived that afternoon, he took one look at the wound and said, "You should be in a hospital." "No time," Rhett rasped, shaking his head. "The hearing's tomorrow." Clara tried to stop him, tears bright in her eyes, but Rhett only pressed her hand with what little strength he had left. "If we lose Jonah, I won't forgive myself." The night before the trial, their home felt fragile, walls still smoky from fire, children restless in sleep. Clara sat beside Rhett, binding his ribs as gently as she could, her hands trembling. He didn't complain, only held her gaze with quiet resolve. Their bodies were weary, their hope tested by flames and betrayal, yet a bond stronger than blood was holding them upright. Tomorrow in the courtroom it would not be money or power that decided Jonah's fate. It would be the truth of who had really fought for him, who had bled for him, and who had stood when running would have been easier. The next morning the courthouse brimmed with tension. Every bench was filled townsfolk, church members, ranchers who had heard the rumors. Emery sat tall at the plaintiff's table, his suit pressed, his lawyer sharp-tongued. He wasted no time painting Clara as reckless and unworthy. An unwed woman, he declared, living under another man's roof, leaving her child unattended, stained by scandal. She is no fit mother. Murmurs rippled through the room and Clara's cheeks burned with shame. But she held Jonah close, her arms steady, even as her heart trembled. Then Rhett rose. His limp was obvious, his cane tapping softly on the wooden floor. The courtroom quieted. His voice, low but firm, carried more weight than the lawyer's polished words. "My name is Thomas Morgan," he began, steadying himself against the table. "I am not Jonah's father, not by blood, but I have seen this woman raise him with more love and courage than most men here will ever understand." He turned to the judge. "No paper can measure what that boy feels in her arms. No signature can erase the nights she soothed him or the mornings she worked with blistered hands just to keep him fed. Emery left before his son was born, but Clara never left, not once. She is his mother in every way that matters." Silence followed, thick and undeniable. The judge leaned back, eyes heavy with thought, then struck the gavel once. "I have heard enough. Custody remains with Clara Hart. Case dismissed." Gasps filled the room. Emery surged to his feet, but the bailiff stepped forward, warning him back. Clara wept quietly, Jonah pressed against her shoulder. Ellie ran down the aisle and wrapped herself around Clara's skirt. Thomas placed a steady hand on Clara's back, his eyes raw but full of pride. Spring laid its gentle hand across the Morgan ranch, softening the scars of fire and trial. The grass returned greener, the creek ran clear with snowmelt, and wildflowers leaned in the breeze as if bowing to a new beginning. Inside the house, life settled into a rhythm, ordinary but radiant in its simplicity. Clara's sewing basket sat open by the window, threads spilling like rays of color as she showed Ellie how to braid a doll's hair from scraps of twine. Jonah gurgled on the floor, beating his wooden horse against the boards with a grin that filled the room. Nearby, Thomas mended a cabinet hinge sleeves, rolled high, a smudge of sawdust across his cheek. The sound of his humming drifted through the house, unremarkable yet grounding. Supper smelled of stew and fresh bread, the kind of meal born from shared effort and quiet devotion. At the table that evening, Ellie placed napkins with great importance, sliding one beside Jonah's chair, though he only banged his spoon against it. Clara ladled stew, Thomas poured water, and for the first time there was no tension, no distance, just a family breaking bread together. When Ellie leaned toward Clara, sniffed her sleeve, and whispered softly, "She smells like Mama," the words no longer startled the room into silence. Instead, they opened it. Thomas paused mid-bite, his gaze steady on Clara. Her eyes were damp, but her smile was sure not apologetic. Slowly, deliberately, Thomas answered, "She does. She really does." Then across the table, his hand sought hers. Clara's fingers wove through his, steady as a vow. Later, beneath the cottonwood tree, the porch swing creaked under new weight. Thomas had repaired it days earlier, adding a second seat close beside the first. Now, as dusk painted the sky in amber and indigo, Clara settled with Jonah asleep against her chest, Ellie curled under a quilt by her side. Thomas lowered himself into the seat next to her. The swing rocked gently, crickets humming their own hymn. For a long while, neither spoke. The air was filled with the scent of damp earth pine and the faint sweetness of Clara's hair as it brushed his shoulder. Finally, she whispered almost to herself, "I thought I came here just to survive." She turned her cheek into his shirt, her voice steadier this time. "But now, I don't want to leave. Not ever." Thomas looked down at her, the weight of years of loneliness shifting like storm clouds breaking. He didn't answer with grand words, only pressed a kiss to the crown of her head and let his arm rest around her shoulders. The swing rocked on, carrying them into night. They were not bound by blood nor by convenience. Their union had been written instead in the fire of trial, in the storm of judgment, in the quiet persistence of choosing each other, day after day. A broken rancher, a wandering mother, two children born of different sorrows now stitched together into something stronger. A family not of circumstance, but of choice. And in that choice, they found not just survival, but belonging. The prairie night held its breath as the Morgan porch light flickered softly, casting a warm glow over the small family gathered close. They were not tied together by bloodlines or by names written in a family Bible. Their bond had been forged instead in storms weathered in sleepless nights by sick beds and the courage to stay when leaving might have been easier. What held them was not circumstance but choice, a choice made again and again in the quiet details of daily life. Thomas, Clara, Ellie, and Jonah did not look like a family that tradition would recognize. Yet as they sat together, one child asleep, the other tucked under a blanket, and the two adults leaning into each other's strength, it was clear they had built something real. It was not a perfect story nor an easy one, but it was theirs. And perhaps that was the deeper truth of the frontier. Families weren't always born, they were built. Sometimes out of loss and ruin, people found each other and dared to start again. So if this tale moved you, if you felt hope when Ellie whispered she smells like mama, or if you saw your own longing in the way Thomas opened his heart, you already know the lesson. Love is not bound by blood. Home is not made of walls. And second chances can build families stronger than the first.